Guys, this is module 15. We're talking about evolutionary psychology and how that helps us to understand human nature. Okay, so evolutionary psychologists, in contrast to behavioral geneticists that want to look at the differences in humans, evolutionary psychologists want to understand why we're so similar due to our shared ancestry. So, evolutionary psychologists use Darwin's principle of natural selection, which is the principle that inherited traits that better enable an organism to survive and reproduce in a particular environment will be most likely passed on in succeeding generations. Great example of natural selection is in giraffes. The reason why giraffes today have long necks is because it was better adapted to their environment to be able to reach high heights. And so those animals were able to survive and reproduce. Now, over time, traits that give an individual or a species a reproductive advantage are what we call selected for, and those will prevail and those will be passed down. Now, animal breeding experiments, like if you own a designer dog, like a Labradoodle, that is basically a manipulation of genetic selection. So instead of allowing nature to choose for the traits that best fit the environment, humans are purposely selecting traits that they would like to see. And they've done this in examples of foxes. They've actually purposely bred foxes for like their docile nature. And so there have been people who have made foxes through breeding that are basically like dogs in how cuddly and loving they are. Now, natural selection chooses these advantages, these advantageous traits through our gene combinations as well as gene mutations, which are random errors in gene replication that leads to a change. So sometimes mutations, if they help that population or that individual survive better, it will be passed down because it's advantageous. Now, our ability to respond to different environments contributes to what we call fitness. And our fitness is basically our ability to survive and reproduce. We're not talking about like gains fitness. We're talking about our adaptive fitness, how easily we can survive and reproduce in a given environment. Now, as humans, basically, we are very, very similar genetically. And in fact, it's interesting. If you were to study, say, a very specific ethnic group, let's say Japanese people living in Japan, if you were to study Japanese people versus, let's say, Danish people, the difference between a Danish person and a Japanese person genetically is actually very small. The amount of variation can only be about 5%. There's only about a 5% difference max. Now, within a population, let's say we're just studying the Japanese, that is where there is much more variability. So, a Japanese person might actually be less similar genetically to another Japanese person than a French person. So the differences in averages is smaller across groups than within groups. Now, how did we develop the shared genome? Well, basically through natural selection. So, for example, lots of women, when they're pregnant, or people who are pregnant, they feel nausea in the early stages, which kind of limits the types of foods they eat. And that was selected for most likely because it prevented pregnant people from eating foods that might have had toxins in them, which is what lots of women are kind of disgusted by when they are pregnant. Now, we also, as humans, have very similar moral instincts cross-culturally. So it probably points to the fact that we have developed these ideas via natural selection because they helped us to survive and thrive. And evolutionary theory, what its goal is to help explain why we do the things we do today, given our ancestors' environment. Now, so here's the thing. Sometimes our bodies and our brains are wired, because evolution moves slowly, our bodies and brains are wired to fit our old environment, our prehistoric environment. And in our modern world, our body is not always in sync with today's environment. We're not perfectly adapted for it. So for example, lots of people struggle with weight, being overweight, especially in the US. And in part, it's because the way our bodies are designed are for our ancestors' environment where food was scarce. And so things that are like sweets and fats are very delectable to us, and they stick onto our body very easily because our bodies back then had to be prepared for long periods of time without eating, famine. So it's a problem today, though, because our environment is different. We don't have famines as frequently, especially not in our society in the US. And so that disconnect can lead to issues of us not being perfectly adapted. Now, some explanations of human sexuality. So, in most ways, males and females are very similar across the board. Males and females are more similar than two females or two males. So generally, males and females are more similar than the individual differences within a population. However, there are sex differences between these two groups. And the main one, is in regards to reproduction. So cross-culturally, we find that men tend to have higher sex drives than females. And this is the largest sex difference between these two. Interestingly, this also applies to gay men and lesbian women as well. So gay men tend to have higher sex drives than lesbian women. Also, males tend to perceive women as being more interested in sex than women actually are when we're talking about heterosexual couples. So sometimes a female might be being kind or friendly to a male, and the male will misperceive that as being flirtatious. Also, interestingly, females tend to be more selective in their sexual partners than men, and there's a reason for this. When a woman is reproducing, she has to be with that baby for 9 months in the womb and then pretty much raise that child. And so females tend to be more choosy with their sexual partners because they want to have someone that's going to help them with the raising of the child. So you want to choose someone that is dependable, has resources, those kinds of things. This is why, in part, women that are straight tend to prefer men who seem mature, dominant, bold, and wealthy or affluent. Now, some physical features that heterosexual women tend to prefer are tall men with slim waists and broad shoulders. And these are all signs of reproductive success. Heterosexual males tend to prefer women with smooth skin and youth, which can signal health and fertility. They're also attracted to a specific hip to waist ratio, which also signals fertility. And also, men are most attracted to women in their mid-20s because that is when women are the most fertile. So when teenage boys are younger, they're most attracted to women in their mid-20s. When they're in their mid-20s, they're most attracted to women in their mid-20s. And as old men, they're most attracted to women in their mid-20s. Now, here's some critiques of the evolutionary perspective. The evolutionary perspective, one issue with it is that we're kind of working from the effect and trying to figure out the cause from the effect versus the other way. And so people say, well, we're kind of just, maybe there's some hindsight bias happening here. Also, social psychologists say it can't all be due to, our genes. There are things that we learn from what our cultures tell us how to behave, which we call social scripts. And those social scripts could be explaining some of this behavior, like why women are more choosy with males, because we're taught that it is unacceptable to, be promiscuous with many males. Also, there are some traits that are hard to explain, or behaviors that are hard to explain in terms of natural selection. for example, suicide. That really goes against evolutionary principles in general, which is to survive and reproduce. So the thing to remember here is that your genes are not your destiny. Your genes kind of lay the groundwork, and then your environment is going to interact with that as well. And you also get a choice in what you do. It's not totally predetermined by your genes and your environment. So some reflections on nature and nurture and their interaction. First, our genes form us. They kind of set the groundwork, like I said. Second, though, our experiences also help form us. They kind of shape us into who we are. Now, sometimes nature and nurture can work together, and there can be this thing called the multiplier effect. So let's say, for example, a person is naturally beautiful as a child. That child is likely to get some nurture in the sense that they're going to be maybe pushed towards that direction of being recognized for their looks. And this could then lead to them, pursuing a career later in something to do with their looks, like modeling. Same thing with like a athlete. Let's say a child is born with exceptional motor skills. That child, though they already have that genetically, they're going to be reinforced by their environment, which could have a bigger effect than either nature or nurture alone. So we are the product of nature and nurture, but we are also an open system. So genes and culture are all pervasive. They're everywhere, but they are not all powerful. Because sometimes, our genes don't always explain all of our behaviors, like why people may not reproduce. And that's rejecting an evolutionary role. People also defy peer pressures, which is kind of it's kind of rejecting a cultural influence. So the thing is to remember is that we are both creatures and creators of our world. We are made of genes and made by our environment. However, we can also kind of shape what our world is like. And everything psychological is also biological. So everything that's happening in our mind has some correlation to something that's happening in our brain or body. And the thing to remember is that nature works via nurture. Okay, so they're working together always. And here are your test yourself questions. See you later.